My son held up the last thing my wife ever made over a fire at a party and said, "Nobody wants her junk, Dad. Just let me toss it." And he did. I watched the flames take it. I stood 15 feet away, holding a plastic cup I forgot I had, and I watched 2 years of my wife's hands disappear into the smoke. She had sewn the last stitch in that quilt 6 days before she died. I know, because I was sitting at the kitchen table when she did, and she held it up to show me, and she was so tired she could barely lift her arms, and she smiled anyway. And she said there, "Now that's done." He burned it. He burned it because it looked old and worn, and because it embarrassed him in front of his new house and his new friends, and because he had decided, the way young people do before they understand what time costs, that the past was something you traded in for the future. I'm going to tell you what he burned. I'm going to tell you what it was worth, in money, yes, but not only in money. And I'm going to tell you what I found in the ashes afterward, because what I found is the reason I can tell this story without bitterness. Not without grief. Without bitterness. Those are different things, and it took me a long time to learn the difference. My name is Dennis Calloway. I'm 57 years old. I taught high school history for 30 years in a small town in Western Virginia. My wife, Martha, taught second grade at the same school for 26 of those years. We raised our son, Kyle, in a greenhouse on a corner lot, and we spent our weekends at estate sales and antique markets. Not because we had money to spend, but because we loved the stories that came attached to old things. That's the historian in both of us. The belief that every object someone kept is a sentence in a longer story, and that if you learn to read them, you understand people better than they understood themselves. Martha was a quilter. I've been since before I knew her. Her grandmother taught her, and her grandmother's grandmother taught the grandmother, and the tradition ran back through the women of her family like a thread through a needle. She quilted the way other people read, constantly, automatically, the way hands need to be busy while the mind works. Every winter of our marriage, she had a quilt frame up in the living room. I used to complain about the space it took, and she used to ignore me completely, and I'd end up sitting next to it while she worked, and we'd talk. And some of the best conversations of my 32 years with Martha happened across a quilt frame I pretended to resent. I want you to understand how ordinary the quilt frame was in our house, because it matters for what Kyle didn't see. It was just always there, the way a dining table is always there, or a bookshelf. It was part of the background of our marriage, unremarkable, to me, to Kyle, to anyone who walked through our door. We ate dinner beside it. We watched television in the same room with it. Kyle grew up with a mother who was always working on something with her hands. And because it was always there, because it never wasn't there, it became invisible the way the most constant things become invisible. You stop seeing what never changes. You stop seeing what you've always had. That's the lesson right there, actually, and I'll come back to it. But first, let me tell you about the last frame. Before I tell you about the last one, do me one small kindness. If you have ever failed to see the value in something until it was too late to save it, tap subscribe. It's free. And it tells me this story found a right person. And stay to the end, because I'm going to ask you something I genuinely don't know the answer to, and I want to hear how you'd have called it. Martha got sick 3 years ago. Ovarian cancer, the same thing that took her mother. She fought it the way she did everything. Quietly, steadily, without self-pity, with a ferocity that looked like serenity because she never raised her voice about it. And in the last 2 years of her life, when she couldn't teach anymore, when she couldn't garden or cook the complicated things she loved or walk the hill we'd walked on Sunday evenings for 30 years, she quilted. Every day, she had the strength. She was in her chair with a frame. And in those 2 years, she put everything she had into one last piece. I want to tell you what it was like to live in that house during those 2 years because I think it matters for understanding what I missed. Martha quilting was a quiet thing. It didn't announce itself. She didn't say, "I'm pouring the last of myself into this." She just sat and worked the same way she'd sat and worked every winter of our marriage. And if you were watching from the outside, it looked like more of the same. That was her gift. The capacity to make the extraordinary look like the ordinary, to make the love and the labor look like just another afternoon in a greenhouse on a corner lot. I lived in that house with her for 2 years while she made something museum quality, and I thought she was just doing what she'd always done. because she always made it look like she was just doing what she'd always done. I didn't understand until I had 4 squares on a kitchen table and a magnifying glass and all the time in the world that just doing what she'd always done was the most heroic thing I'd ever seen. I have to tell you what a Baltimore album quilt is, because it's the whole story. Baltimore album quilts are one of the great American art forms. They originated in Maryland in the 1840s, and each one is a collection of applique squares, flowers, birds, baskets, wreaths, each square its own small picture, each one sewn by hand with a patience and a skill that most people today cannot comprehend. The old ones, the great ones, are in museums. They sell at auction for sums that would buy a house. The older and more intricate the work, the more they're worth, to collectors, to institutions, to anyone who understands what it means to spend 2 years of your hands on a single thing. What most people don't know, what Kyle certainly didn't know, is that Baltimore album quilts were not decorative. They were communicative. Each square was chosen deliberately, with meaning attached to the image the way meaning attaches to words. A particular flower combination meant a particular thing. A bird in flight meant something different from a bird at rest. The women who made these quilts were writing, not in words, which required literacy that many of them didn't have, but in a visual language they'd spent lifetimes learning. They were leaving records. They were speaking to whoever came after and knew enough to listen. Martha was a teacher who had spent 30 years in a profession built on making things legible to people who couldn't yet read them. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she made something in the language of the women who came before her, patient, deliberate, full of private meaning, and she left it where she trusted it would find the right reader. She left it with me, and Kyle never knew. That's the thing I have to say before I tell you what happened at the party, because it's part of the truth. Kyle didn't know what the quilt was. I never told him what a Baltimore album quilt was, never explained the tradition, never sat down and pointed at a square and said, "This is what your mother is trying to say." I'd brought it to his house that evening, assuming he would see it the way I saw it. But I'd spent 30 years learning to see things that way, and Kyle hadn't because I'd never thought to teach him. The invisible quilt frame in our living room, the one I'd sat beside for 30 years, I'd never explained to my son what his mother was saying in it. I'd assumed the love was legible. It wasn't, not to a 34-year-old man who grew up thinking an old blanket was just an old blanket. Some portion of what happened that night, I carry too. I need you to know that before I tell you the rest. Let me tell you about that night. Kyle and his wife Becca had bought their first house, a nice place, new construction, big yard in a subdivision outside town, and they threw a housewarming party, and I brought the quilt. I want to be honest about why. I knew, logically, the new modern house wasn't the right place for it, but I wasn't thinking logically. I was thinking the way a grieving man thinks, which is that Martha had made this thing, and the only place I wanted it to be was somewhere Kyle would see it every day, somewhere it would be present in his life the way she would have been. I wanted to put something of her in his house. I thought he'd understand. I got there before most of the guests, and I laid it over the back of a chair in the living room. It looked beautiful there, those red and green squares glowing against the white ground. I thought she'd have liked seeing it here. And then people started arriving, and the party got loud, and I went and got a drink and talked with people I didn't know, and at some point the way you do at parties, I stopped paying attention to where the quilt was. And a while later, I noticed the chair was empty. And I looked around, and I saw Kyle carrying it through the back door with both hands, the way you carry something you want to be done with, and I called his name, and he either didn't hear me or didn't stop. And by the time I got through the crowd and through the back door, he'd already tossed it into the fire pit. It caught fast. I need you to understand how fast. It was old cotton and old batting, dry as paper, decades old. And the flames took it the way flames take everything that took years to make. There was no recovering it. There was no pulling it out and saving it. By the time my hand reached for his arm, it was already beyond what any amount of wanting could fix. "Dad," Kyle's voice was already apologetic, but not yet understanding. The voice of a man who's done something thoughtless and knows it, not yet a man who knows what he's actually done. "Dad, I'm sorry, I didn't think. It was just looking kind of ratty, and people kept asking about it, and it was embarrassing, all right? It was old and faded, and it looked like something from a thrift store, and Becca's been working so hard on the house. And that was the last thing your mother ever made, I said. She finished it 6 days before she died. And I walked back inside, because there was nothing else to say, and because I needed to be somewhere I wasn't watching it burn. If you're still with me, do me that kindness and tap subscribe before I tell you what I found in the ashes. Because what I found in the ashes is the part of this story that matters most, and I don't want to rush it. I went home that night without saying goodbye to anyone. I sat in our kitchen, the kitchen where Martha's frame used to be, and I had the particular grief of a man who has just lost something twice. Lost his wife when she died, and then lost the last piece of her hands when her son threw it in a fire. It's a specific, terrible thing, that kind of double loss. The first grief is the big one, the one everyone sees. The second one is the quiet kind that nobody tells you about. The grief of objects disappearing, of the physical traces of a person eroding one by one until you can no longer touch anything that touched them. That kitchen was very quiet for a long time. The chair where I used to sit beside the frame was still there. Nothing had been in it since Martha got too sick to quilt, which was almost a year before she died. I'd been aware of the empty chair every day since. The quilt had felt, while I had it, like the last tangible thing, the last piece of evidence that her hands had existed in the world, that she had made things, that she had been in this house doing the patient, careful work she loved. And now that was gone too, and the chair was empty, and the kitchen was quiet, and there was a particular density to the air that I recognized from the night she died, when the house stopped being a place 2 people lived and became a place 1 person survived. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in our bed, and I looked at the ceiling, and I tried to remember all 48 squares, what I'd seen of them in the quick moments I'd handled the quilt. I could only place about a dozen with certainty. The rest I'd never stopped to look at. I'd had 2 years of proximity to the thing she was making, and I'd never once sat down and asked her to show me the squares and tell me what they meant. I'd assumed I'd have time. We always assume we'll have time. I lay there cataloging everything I'd assumed, and it was a long list, and the ceiling gave me no answers at all. In the morning, I called Kyle, not to make him feel worse. He already felt terrible. I could hear it, but because of something that had come to me in the night, something I needed to know. I told him to go out to the fire pit before anything was disturbed, and to see if anything had survived at the edge. Fabric burns, but it doesn't always burn evenly. The center of a pile goes first. The edges sometimes make it. Kyle called me back 20 minutes later. He found something. Not much. A corner of the quilt, maybe 4 squares, scorched and fragile, but recognizable, that had landed away from the center of the fire and half survived. He asked if he should save it. I told him yes. I told him to handle it like broken glass. He brought it to me that afternoon, and I took those 4 squares to the kitchen table, and I sat down with them and my magnifying glass, the one I use for reading the small print on old documents, and I did what a history teacher does. I looked at them. And here's the thing about quilts, friend, that most people who aren't quilters don't know. A Baltimore album quilt was never just a blanket. Each square was chosen on purpose. Each image meant something, told something about the maker's life, her family, her faith, her history. The women who made them were writing, not in words, but in cloth and thread. They were writing their lives into something that would last. And Martha was a history teacher's wife who had spent 30 years watching me believe exactly that about old documents and objects. She knew what a primary source was. She knew what evidence looked like. And she had been very, very deliberate. The first surviving square was a schoolhouse, a perfect little red schoolhouse, every brick hand-stitched. It took me a moment, and then I understood. The school where we met. The school where we both taught. The school where Kyle took his first steps in the hallway, because sometimes Martha brought him in as a baby on late afternoons when I had papers to grade. Square 2 was a greenhouse on a corner lot. Our house. Exact detail, the porch, the window boxes Martha always kept, the particular angle of the roof. She had stitched our home into a square the size of a dinner plate. The third square was a tulip design, but the tulips were in a very specific color combination. A dusty rose and a soft yellow that I recognized as the colors of the bouquet I'd brought her on our first date. I had not thought of those colors in 30 years. She had kept them, and the fourth square, the corner square, the one most scorched, was just barely readable. It was a hand, a single open hand, stitched in cream thread on white ground, so subtle you'd nearly miss it. And around the wrist of the hand, in the tiniest embroidery I had ever seen, were letters. I used a magnifying glass to read them. They were a date, the date Kyle was born. She had stitched all of us into it. Our school, our house, our first date, our son's birth. And these were only 4 squares out of 48. The whole quilt had been a map, a life told in cloth, a letter written in thread, 48 chapters of what she considered worth remembering. And Kyle had burned it because it looked like something from a thrift store. I sat with those 4 squares for a long time, and the grief I felt was different from the grief of the night before. Less wild. It was the grief of a man who now understood what he had almost lost completely, and who understood for the first time exactly how far his wife's love had been willing to go to make itself legible, even when she knew she was running out of time to speak. She knew she was dying. She knew there was a chance she'd leave before she could say everything that needed saying. So she stitched it. She turned her life into a document, knowing that if a history teacher married to an antiques woman ever sat down and really looked, he would find it. She made a primary source. She left it in the hands of the one man she trusted to read it. 2 months after the housewarming, I had those 4 squares appraised by a textile historian at the university. A woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who specializes in American folk art and needlework. I brought her the fragments and told her the story, and I watched her face while she examined them, first with her naked eye, then with a loop, then with some kind of light source she angled across the surface. She was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet a professional gets when they're trying to make sure they're right before they say something significant. And then she said something I wasn't prepared for. She said that based on the style, the materials, the workmanship, the specific technique of the applique, the thread count, the type of batting visible at the scorched edges, the particular way the embroidery had been laid into the surface, Martha's quilt had been, in her professional assessment, one of the finest contemporary Baltimore album quilts she had ever examined. Possibly the finest. The skill was extraordinary. Museum quality, she said, twice, as if once might not be enough. She said institutions she could name would have been interested in acquiring it. She said that intact, a quilt of that quality and size would have been conservatively $60,000 to $80,000. She paused, and she looked at me over her glasses, and she said, "I'm sorry for your loss." Both of them. The drive home was one of those quiet ones where the car seems to drive itself. Not angry, not bereft, full of the understanding that my wife had spent the last 2 years of her life making something that a stranger could recognize, from 4 burnt scraps, as extraordinary. That her love had been, measurably, to a professional who had never met her, of the highest quality. The world had a way of confirming what I already knew, and the confirmation was almost more than I could hold on a quiet drive home in the dark. I want to tell you how I felt when she said that. And I want to be honest, because the honest answer is complicated. My first feeling was something cold and sharp, the arithmetic of what Kyle had done, rendered in real numbers. $60,000 his mother had made, with her own hands, in the last 2 years of her life, burning in a fire pit while a party went on 15 feet away, because it looked ratty. But the feeling underneath that, the one that was still there after the cold, sharp thing passed, was something different, something closer to awe. Because Martha hadn't known the dollar figure. Martha hadn't quilted to make something worth $60,000. Martha had quilted to say 60,000 things she didn't have time to say out loud. And the fact that Dr. Osei could recognize the mastery in those stitches, that it was visibly, measurably extraordinary, only meant that the love in it was more intense than even I had understood. She made something great. Quietly, at a frame in her living room, in the last 2 years of her life, sick and exhausted and choosing every day to keep going. And the greatness wasn't in spite of the love. The greatness was the love. Every master stitch was an hour of her hands moving through pain, making something permanent. She stitched like it mattered because to her it did, because we matter, because she needed us to have a record. And the record almost burned entirely. I did not tell Kyle the appraised value for a long time. Not out of cruelty. I had let go of cruelty somewhere in the middle of those 4 squares. But because I knew, with the instinct of a father and a teacher, that the money was the wrong lesson. The thing Kyle needed to understand was not what the quilt cost. It was what it meant. And those are not the same lesson, and they don't arrive at the same time. So I waited. I waited until Kyle came to me. Not with excuses. Those had already come in the days after the party, and I'd receive them as kindly as I could, because excuses from a child are also a form of I know what I did, even when they sound like it wasn't my fault. But the excuses weren't what I was waiting for. I was waiting for the real thing. The specific, adult grief of understanding what you've done, not defended against, not explained away, just held. It took a few months, and one afternoon he drove over without calling, which is the thing adult children do when they have something real to say. And he sat at Martha's kitchen table, and he didn't start talking right away, and I let him not. And then he said, "Dad, I know there's nothing I can do to undo it. And I know there isn't a version of this where I'm not the person who burned Mom's last quilt. I'm going to have to live with that. I just need you to know that I know." He didn't ask me to forgive him. I noticed. He didn't ask for anything. He just told me what he knew. And that, the not asking, the just saying, is how I knew he was ready to understand the rest. And I set the 4 squares on the table between us. And I told him what they meant, the schoolhouse, the greenhouse on the corner, the first 8 colors, the birth date around the wrist. I went slowly. I let each one land before I moved to the next. And I watched my son look at those fragments and understand, for the first time, what his mother had spent 2 years of her dying hand saying to us. Not to the world, not to a museum, to us. His face did everything it needed to do, and I didn't look away, because he'd earned the right to be seen doing it. And then I told him the rest. The mastery first, what Dr. Osei had said, what it meant that a stranger could recognize the quality from 4 burnt scraps. And then the money. I watched him absorb it slowly, one thing at a time, the way a person absorbs a thing that's too big to take in all at once. And I said, one time, what I needed to say, your mother didn't make it to be valuable. She made it to be ours. The value just tells you how hard she worked to say what she was saying. He didn't say anything for a while. And then he said, "What do we do now?" And that question, not what can I do, not how do I fix it, but what do we do, is the question I've been waiting for without knowing it. Because it made us we again. It made us both the people left behind by the same woman, responsible together for what remained. What we did together is this. We framed the 4 fragments, museum style, with a written description of the quilt, what it was when it was made, what we know of the 48 squares she chose. It hangs in Kyle's living room, in a house where the quilt burned. Not to punish him. He chose the location. He said, "I want to see it every day. I want to remember what I almost let disappear entirely." And underneath the framed fragments, on a small card in my handwriting, is the date Martha finished the last stitch, 6 days before she died. Dr. Osei has those 4 squares now for proper archival preservation. They are, as much as science can make them, permanent. What is left of Martha's last work is safe and known and documented, and that matters. It matters that someone who can read the work has seen it and named it and recorded it. History is made of partial records. That's the first thing I ever taught, the thing I told every class every September for 30 years. We never have the whole thing. We work with the fragments that survived. And sometimes the fragments are enough to tell you everything you need to know. These 4 squares are enough. A schoolhouse, a greenhouse on a corner lot, first 8 colors in a tulip design, a birth date embroidered around a hand. For chapters of 48, and in those 4 chapters, where we met, where we lived, how we began, and what we made together. If you can read it, and I can read it because she made it for a man who spent 30 years learning how you have the whole shape of a life. For squares of a woman's last 2 years is not what we had, but it is something, and something, when you've been close to nothing, is everything. I spent 30 years teaching children to read history, to look at old things and ask what they meant, who made them, what it cost to make them, what they were trying to say. And the hardest lesson I ever tried to teach, the one I'd tell you still matters more than anything in any curriculum, is this: the value in an old thing is almost never its dollar price. The value is the time. The value is the human being who decided, against everything else they could have spent their hours on, to make something that would last. Every old quilt, every old letter, every worn piece of furniture that a family kept across 3 generations, somebody paid for in hours, in hands, in the same finite mortal time that you and I are spending right now. My son burned $60,000 because it looked like a thrift store blanket, but that isn't really what he burned. What he burned was 2 years of his dying mother's hands, 48 squares of her life as she chose to record it, a love letter she wrote in thread because she was running out of time to speak. The money is just the world's way of confirming what a quilter already knew, that a thing made with extraordinary care is worth something extraordinary. She said there, now that's done, 6 days before she died. And she was right. It was done. It was finished, and it was whole, and it was extraordinary, and most of it is gone now, and nothing changes that. I have thought a great deal in the years since about what done means. Martha finished the quilt knowing she was leaving. She knew the quilt would outlast her. She made something permanent in the full knowledge of her own impermanence, and she handed it forward, and she trusted us to take care of it. And we failed that trust, or rather, I failed it because I brought it to the wrong place without the right explanation, and Kyle failed it because he made a fast decision about the value of something old without stopping to look. Between us, we let 80% of it burn, and neither of us can undo that. The fire is the fire. What happened, happened. But 4 squares survived the fire. 4 out of 48. And here is what I have learned. The hardest lesson of my 57 years, harder than anything I ever stood at a chalkboard and tried to teach. You don't get to choose the size of what survives. You only get to choose what you do with it. You can grieve the 44, or you can read the 4. You can live in the loss, or you can live in the remainder. I have tried to live in the remainder. Most days I can. Some days the empty chair wins. But most days I sit with 4 squares, a schoolhouse and a corner house and first 8 colors and a birth date embroidered in thread so fine it takes a magnifying glass to read. And I read it, and I let it be enough because it has to be. Because she finished it so it would be. Because she knew that even if most of it burned, the part that survived would still say what she meant to say. She built the redundancy in. She made 48 chances. She knew me. She knew what I did with fragments. She left me 4. So here's my question, and I mean it, when Kyle said, I want to see it every day, and chose to put the framed fragments in his own living room. Was that enough? Is there a way for a person to make right the burning of a thing that cannot be unburned? Or is that a debt that just has to be carried? I've thought about it every day since. Tell me down in the comments how you see it. And tell me if you have something in your house right now, something old and plain looking that you've never really stopped to read. If this story meant something to you, do me that kindness, subscribe, hit like, and go look at the old things in your life this week. The ones that look like junk. Read them like a historian would. Ask who made them, and when, and why they kept going when it was hard. The answer is almost always the same, and it's almost always worth knowing. I'll see you next time. A note before you go. This story is a work of fiction, written and dramatized for entertainment. The names, characters, and events are invented, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. But if its lessons stayed with you, that the things made with extraordinary care are worth more than they look, and that love leaves records if we learn how to read them, then it did its job. Go find the old things. Read them. We'll see you in the next one.